everybody hear me? Good morning. My name is Frank Eckert. I'm from the science faculty, and as part of the summer school, what we tend to do is try to put together a session of about 4 or 5 speakers that are thematically linked. So this year's theme is the topic of bad science. So there's a lot of hard, good science out there, but increasingly there's also a lot of bad science out there that is being amplified by things like social media. And quite often, a lot of this pseudoscience or fake science, whatever you want to call it, is getting a lot of traction. So it is fair to say that there are a lot of scientific disciplines that are pushing back on this. So we'd like to find out how to basically expose and identify some of that bad science. So we have a number of different topics over the next couple of days, from HIV to cell and gene therapy, astronomy, trading, stock markets, and machines sort of playing with the numbers. Today's topic is brought to us by Bruce Hewitson, who's going to talk about climate change and reality check. So Bruce is a SARCHI chair, NRF chair. He's also director of the Climate Systems Analysis Group at UCT, a formidable powerhouse of climate research that is doing in-house modeling, regional modeling, downscaling, adaptation. Bruce has been an author, a lead author on a number of IPCC reports, so he's been very much at the sharp end of putting climate data together, taking it to policymakers. He has a whole wide range of different interests. I want to make sure I don't leave anything out. You also sort of work on climate in cities and the interaction of climate information and ethics. So I have great pleasure to present to you Bruce Hewitson, and over to you for a very interesting talk. Thank you, Bruce.
Thanks. Great, thank you. So I'm not going to talk so much about bad science as the bad usage of science, because there's not much around bad science in the climate arena at the moment that's going on. If you want an example of bad science, a bad science in climate is, how many of you think of the atmosphere acts like a blanket, or the greenhouse effect acts like a blanket? Yeah, well, it doesn't. Okay. It's a very different process, but it's a convenient message, but that's bad science. But I'm not going to talk about bad science. I'm also not going to try and convince you about climate change. Okay, that's, I'm taking that as a given. If you're a climate change denier or you're skeptical about it, that's great. I respect that. My purpose here today is just to get you to rethink your position. I am seriously depressed about the future. I think we are, the word climate catastrophe is not an overstatement. I think we are facing in the coming decades a globally disrupted society. We've seen the disruption when you have the migration out of the Middle East in the last decade. Imagine that tenfold increased. What do you do with 150 million people migrating out of Bangladesh with sea level rise? Those sorts of things. There are a whole bunch of triggers that are poised to disrupt the way our fragile, globally interconnected society works. So I want to deal with that. I want to help you move from awareness to sensitized. You're all aware of climate change. It's everywhere. But you remember the Cape Town drought and the call for saving water. How much of the city saved water? What, 40, 50%? Really engaged with saving water? Everybody was aware of it, but only a small proportion were sensitized enough to actually do something about it. And that's our climate change issue. How do we move from aware of climate change to be sensitized enough to take our own responsible role in looking for solutions and how we go forward with that? And so I call this an ethical epistemic problem. So ethical because it's rooted in values. Because we've made choices in the past, that's brought us to where we are. We're going to make choices to going into the future. That's going to change our future. So it's an ethical thing. It's rooted in values and choice. It's also epistemic. Epistemic is, how do you know what you know? If you're going to make a choice, you need to know something. You need facts. You need a foundation. And so the epistemic side is, how do you know what you know? Do you just get it from the media? Do you just go to your favorite blog site and just trust the person who's speaking to you? We have a responsibility to think about how we filter the information coming in. So, ethical epistemic to move us from awareness to sensitized. So I'm not going to go into great details about all the horror stories. There are plenty of horror stories around there. And some of our slides, I mean, these will be available as a resource, so I'm not going to go through all the details in all the slides. But, for example, the ocean is 26% more acidic than it was before at the Industrial Revolution. Arctic sea ice and glaciers are melting around the world rapidly, faster than we've even projected. Sea levels are rising the fastest in 2,000 years, etc., etc. We're facing a multiplicity of signatures. And we're talking about numbers of, global warming, we want to stay below 2 degrees, or we're not going to hit that anyway. We'll be lucky if we stay below 3 degrees. But let's just take 1 degree. How big a change is 1 degree global warming? Now, for those of you who have lived in one place for a long time, think about a normal summer, okay? And then think about how hot a very hot summer is. How different do you think the average temperature of those 2 summers is? Give me some numbers. 2 degrees? 5 degrees? 7? It's about 1. 1 degree global warming, or 1 degree mean seasonal temperature change, equates to the difference between an average season and the hottest season. So when we talk about 2 degrees warming, we're talking about the future cold season being like our current normal season. If we talk about 3 degrees global warming, we're talking about a future cold summer being about the same as our current hottest summer. Now leave it to your imagination. What does that mean for the future hottest summer? Okay. So this is serious. Climate features all over the news everywhere. We see it everywhere. And again, I'm not going to go through all of them, but just to highlight a few ones. Australia, the fires in Brazil, California, Alaska, Siberia. I'll talk about the Australia fire just now. But we have all sorts of other things, like Donald Trump. We won't go into that one too much. But we have Greta and the youth movement rising up, catalyzing a younger generation. We have record droughts, floods, and unusual weather. And recently at the COP25 conference of parties 25 in Madrid, we had all the rich nations digging in their heels and preventing a new decision on how to manage climate change. And COP25 is the big international negotiation arena where they make decisions about how we're going to respond as nations. And do you know who are the biggest bankrollers of COP25? The fossil fuel industry. So we have a problem. How do we get society to change? Well, society is governed, so you've got to change governance. How do you change governance? You change the voters. How do you change the voters? I talk to you. Okay, we have to think about a bottom-up approach as well as looking to the top-down approaches. So let's think about how the world might end. So this was a study done a few years ago on the 12 terrifying ways human civilization could end. 11 and 12 was future bad global governance. Well, we see that in Africa a lot. Unknown consequences. Okay, you can't predict a surprise because by definition it's a surprise. Nanotechnology scares a lot of people. Artificial intelligence really scares people, like Elon Musk. A global system catastrophe. We are a system. We are interconnected. Everything you have on your body right now is part of a global interconnected system. Everything we have in this room is part of a global interconnected system. So, the disruption of that system. Synthetic biology is a fear. Supervolcanoes. Personally, I wouldn't have put that at number 5, but anyway, some people are worried about that one. Ecological catastrophes, which are already occurring increasingly. Global pandemics. Major asteroid strike. We can't do much about that, despite what Hollywood says. And number 1, after a nuclear war, was extreme climate change. That was the experts' consideration about the number 1 way civilization as we know it, not that we're going to be wiped out, but the structure of civilization as we know it would be disrupted. So, ethical epistemic problem. Now, this is a cartoon series that I really like called XKCD. And this particular cartoon talks about, over there we have the labyrinth guards. And the labyrinth in this context here is getting information about climate change. One always lies, one always tells the truth, and one stabs people who ask tricky questions. And that is a pretty close reflection of the reality of the world at the moment. And it's up to the individual to be able to discern what the difference is. So there's the epistemology of science, how we talk about science, how we convey our knowledge. And there are different knowledges and value systems. Okay, different knowledges, well, that's the Trump world versus the Brazil world versus the India world versus the China world versus the Africa world. There are different ways of constructing the knowledge about the system. But there are also value systems, equally strongly across there. And what do you do when you hit up somebody with a contested value system? Now, sitting here today, we are pretty much all of the same demographic, which scares me. I think it's a disappointment that we're all of the same demographic here. But we probably have a very similar cultural view in general terms, because we are all a similar demographic. But even with your neighbor, you'll find areas where your values differ, and you'd argue. Now, how do you deal with the decision-making process of climate change responses, which impinge on the natural comfort area of your lifestyle, when you have deeply conflicting value systems within a nation and between nations? And we need to get ready to grips with this idea that our values are internal, are structurally, fundamentally underpinning our response to climate change. Now, you probably all thought I was going to start with Cape Town's drought. And I'm not going to talk about Cape Town's drought, but I'll make just a brief mention over here of it. And the way it works really is that you have a distribution of events, the grey curve, so you go from cold to hot or wet to dry, whichever way you want to put on the x-axis. And when you change the mean climate, you get a disproportionate change in the extremes. And what we're seeing with the Cape Town drought over the last few years was a disproportionate change in the extreme event. So we can't say it was climate change, but we can say it was exacerbated by climate change. And that's that's the approach to most major events that impact us. Oopsie. And the projected future for Cape Town, if you really wanted drier, warmer, and shorter winter rains. So make of that what you will, but I don't want to focus on Cape Town here. So we have this problem. COP25 in Madrid dropped the ball. Okay, the world did not get to grips with making a cohesive, coherent response. And so we're really in trouble. Because before too long, we are going to reach a warming where feedbacks kick in that we are not going to be able to stop. Feedbacks that exacerbate global warming. Feedbacks like the meltback of the permafrost in Siberia, releasing methane. Those sorts of processes that contribute to a positive growth or acceleration of global warming, and if we get to a certain point, we're not going to be able to stop it. So we're in trouble. And you could say that whatever your current or past job was, whether you're retired or not, just about any job title you want to put in that is under stress at this point. Either directly because it's climate sensitive in its activities, or indirectly because it's dependent on the system's linkages, which are themselves impacted by climate. So how do we do about it? Well, the first thing people say, well, give me the data. Well, data is not information. Data are numbers. I can give you so much data. The current global climate models are putting out well over a petabyte of data. How do you process a petabyte of data? That's a challenge in itself. But information, if you get that information out of the data, it's not the same as knowledge. Okay, I can give you lots of information. I can say something about there's a positive advection of auticity in the upper troposphere in the mid-Atlantic. Does that mean anything to you? I've given you information. Knowledge means you understand what the information means. So we have to go to data into information into knowledge. But knowledge is not the same as understanding. I can explain it to you, but sometimes when I explain to students what that statement I just said meant, they can't relate it to reality. There's a mental block there. The translation of the knowledge into an understanding of what it means, truly means, is difficult sometimes. And of course, understanding is not the same as wisdom. That's the one thing that you don't inherit. You don't inherit wisdom. You have to gain your own wisdom. So we live in a non-weird nation. This comes out of the philosophy literature. Weird nations, W-E-I-R-D, is an acronym standing for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic Societies. Okay? Weird nations. I like the acronym. But the philosophy literature is looking at this and saying weird nations like the US, UK, etc., they think differently to what I would call non-weird nations. Okay? Non-Western, non-heavily industrialized, non-rich. Those nations think differently. The weird nations, the philosophy literature tells us, tends to look at problems as an engineering problem. Let's find a structural solution. We'll put in this program, we'll put in this plan, we'll build this machine, we'll have this technology. It'll give us a structural solution to our problem. Non-weird nations, on the whole, tend to look at the problem as a relational problem, a community problem. What does this mean for me and my relationships with people? What does it mean for me and my community? And how do I respond from that lens? And so when you have Western nations coming into developing nations to deal with climate change, you have this fundamental contrast of worldviews, of values. China comes into Africa and says, we will build new infrastructure for you all across the continent. Of course, we'll put you in debt, but we'll do that. But that's a very particular mindset. It takes very little cognizance of the relational nature of the society in Africa. So we have this value system again contested. So to ask these questions of yourself: why do people automatically search for evidence to support what they believe? And why is it almost impossible to stop them believing what they want to believe? Okay, we all do that. Why are humans so amazingly bad at reasoning in some contexts and amazingly good in other contexts? I'm not going to give you the answers to these yet. Why is reasoning so biased and motivated when self-interest and self-presentation are at stake? Now, the answers are probably somewhat intuitive. We like to protect ourselves. We like to protect our comfort zone. We don't like anything that threatens the norm, the status quo that we have. Well, Australia has really threatened it. This is probably one of the most iconic photographs, I think, of the Australian fire. This kangaroo hopping across the fire. You know the size of Austria, the country Austria? That's about the size of Australia that has burnt. It's massive. It's way beyond our comprehension. Now, it's been an unusual season. So there's a temperature graph of the last 100 years of the temperature in December, January, February in the fire region of Australia. And you can see this last December, January, February, or this last coming summer, well, it doesn't go all the way into February, obviously, is an outlier. Way, way high. But you can see also the trend is going up. So what does this higher temperature do? People don't often understand what higher temperatures do. I mean, you go from a hot day of 34 degrees to a hot day of 36 degrees. Why does that make fire more? Well, there's something called a vapor pressure deficit. It's basically how much water vapor the air can hold compared to how much it does hold. And when you increase the temperature, the air can hold much more water. And what that does is actually, it's like sucking the moisture out of the fuel. It's making the fuel even drier. And you don't have to take too much of that moisture out of the fuel for it to become extremely flammable. And of course, in Australia, where there's oil-based vegetation, it takes off like wildfire. Like wildfire, yeah. So these sorts of nominal temperature increases have a major impact on the fire intensity and growth and expansion. I was telling somebody just now, I have a friend who lives in the fire area. She has been living for 6 weeks under stress because of the constant threat of fire near her homestead, within 20 kilometers or so. So this is a signature of the future. This is not climate change, but it's exacerbated by climate change. And it's a signature of what we might be looking at. It's a risk. So the IPCC looks at risk this way. It says it's a hazard, like fire. There's a vulnerability, I'm in a fire zone. There's exposure, I have no way to protect myself. Okay, you combine your exposure, vulnerability, and hazard, and you get an accumulative measure of your risk. So I'd like to challenge you to think when you, after today, when you go home, what is your risk to climate change? What are the hazards you're exposed to? Maybe you're sitting on the edge of a river. Maybe you're sitting 0.5 meter above sea level on a coastal dune. Maybe your vulnerability is that you're going to be flooded out, or your electricity supply is going to go, or your access road is going to be washed away, or something like that. And maybe your exposure is, I don't have the resources to deal with this, or I'm isolated in my community, or I have no community to draw upon. There are different types of exposure, social and physical exposure. So think about your risk. The risk, of course, creates impacts when you are impacted. The impacts go back and affect the actual climate through changing the land surface, for example, and they affect the socioeconomic processes through disrupting society and the activities of society. And those feed back again to change the emissions, change land use change, feeds back to the climate change again. So the natural climate and the socioeconomic processes give rise to our risk, and there's this feedback system. So one of the biggest positives I could suggest that you take away from here is go home and think about what your risk is. What are you going to do to manage your risk? And I can tell you stories about what I'm doing to manage my risk, if we have time for that. So just a quick roundup, because we all know about climate change, just some facts about it. Where the sources of emissions, well, most of it's from the energy sector, but all the way down to the building sector, and of course there's a whole range of other sources, cement production, etc., etc. But we have a fairly good idea behind where the drivers of climate change are coming from. That's not open to debate. We also have a really good understanding of how the world is warming. It's not warming uniformly. And by the way, 2019 is the second warmest year on record, and it's been the hottest decade on record. And there's a blogger who, in 2014, bet one of climate change deniers, I bet you $1,500 that the next 5 years are going to be warmer than any preceding 5 years. And he's just won his bet. And he's probably going to donate his $1,500 to Australian Fire Relief. But there was somebody who's willing to put his money on the line. We also are very good at projecting. There's just a recent paper came out just this last week showing how good our climate models are at capturing the natural behavior of the climate system. So when you go into the future, so the black line is observed historical temperatures. And all the colored lines are different climate models projecting the future under different greenhouse gas emissions. So we have Trump world, RCP, what's called RCP 8.5 here, don't worry about what it means. But basically it means it's a high emission growth world. Okay? That's a world where there's deregulation, fossil fuels run ahead, profits drive the activities, there's no environmental controls, etc., etc. I call that the Trump world. Yes?
Why is the right-hand end forked of the black line?
Oh, because, that's an interesting question. There are multiple observation systems of the global mean temperature. We have different networks of stations, etc., etc. And so you can see the line is not just a thin line, it's actually a line of various thicknesses. And that's the uncertainty. It's the uncertainty around our observations. And when this figure was done, there was still data coming in, so there's a little bit increased uncertainty at that. But we know the observations lie within the black line. But you can see the red lines and the blue lines and the different colors are all pretty much mixed over the lower end of this coming century, but they diverge into the future. And this is where our choices lie. By 2050, do we want to be up here or do we want to be down here? And at the moment, with the emissions going on as they are, we're going to end up off the scale. Okay. This was a very conservative estimate. This is the last IPCC report that came out in 2013. Now, what does it mean for South Africa? Well, here are all the projected mean temperature changes for all the countries in Africa. It's the mean and the scatter, the uncertainty around it. And South Africa, as a national average, is projected to change around about 2.3, 2.4 degrees centigrade. But that's the national average. Gauteng is projected to change up to about 4 degrees. Northern Cape up to 5 or even 6 degrees. Now remember what I said earlier on about what a 1 degree temperature change means? This is climate crisis. This is very serious. And of course, we know the old story that those who contributed the least greenhouse gases are the ones who are going to be most impacted. So the top graph is the nations that cause most of the greenhouse gases. South Africa is not irresponsible for that, but not as much as some of the other countries. And who's going to be most impacted? Well, all the red here are all the developing countries. So there's a value system here again. Ethics, responsibility. What is the responsibility of the weird nations to supporting the developing nations? And this was a fundamental sticking point in the Madrid COP25 meeting.
Could you explain
Yeah.
some parts of the world are less impacted?
Gets a little bit complicated, but there are a couple of ways to measure vulnerability. A lot of it depends on how you define vulnerability, but vulnerability in part is your ability to respond to the impact. So there is a differentiation in the actual impact itself, but a lot of it is caught up in your ability to respond to the impact, and that makes you more vulnerable. So this is one of the IPCC's most characteristic figures. It's called the burning embers diagram, and here they just two of the possible futures: the sort of Greenpeace world, which we'll never reach, the high emission world. And then they translate it into what are the increased risks in various sectors. So we talk about unique and threaded systems, large-scale singular events, etc., etc. And this comes back again to the risk question. what is your willingness to accept a risk? What risk will you take? In other words, when you go out in the morning, you go to certain areas of Cape Town and not to other areas of Cape Town because you think some areas are dangerous. You have a risk profile. I ride a motorbike every day. Some of my colleagues think I'm absolutely mad, but my willingness to accept the risk of a motorbike outweighs my unpleasantness of spending 40 minutes in the traffic in a car. And it's also much more environmentally friendly. So each of us have our own risk that we're willing to accept. What risk are you willing to accept? Because you have to decide your risk level and then respond accordingly. And some of us are very risk averse, which means we have to take strong actions. Other ones are willing to entertain some risk. But in the climate change concept, if you take a high risk, it's not just you, it's society as a whole. So we have to really address this question. Again, it becomes a value question. Now, Christiana Figueres, who was Executive Secretary of the United Nations, what's called the Framework Convention on Climate Change, she was the person who probably single-handedly got the Paris Agreement. You know the Paris Agreement that was decided? She almost single-handedly got that Paris Agreement through. She was an amazing woman. And she made the statement, as we begin to develop strategies for facing climate change, there are three questions. Who's responsible? Who's affected? Who should do something? And she goes on to say, were the answer to all three questions one and the same, the matter would be relatively simple. The fact is the answers are all different and puts us in a perplexing arena of an ethical predicament. Because those who are responsible are not the same as those who are affected, and those who should do something about it are not the same as the other two. There are different answers to those three questions, and that's an ethical question. We are not good at dealing with global ethics because we are a greedy, selfish society. So let's play a game. Let's say your home's on the other side of the river. The bridge has been washed away, your daughter's sick, it's your wedding anniversary, and you've got an SMS that the toilet is blocked and the roof is leaking. Okay, you really need to get home. Okay. The river doesn't seem to be flowing particularly fast, but it's muddy, so you can't see the bottom, and you can't swim. The map shows there is another route home, but it's a major detour on bad routes, think the Eastern Cape or something like that. And this might likely mean you would not make it home tonight. Okay, so you're under pressure. On the remaining pillar in the center of the river, you see a measuring scale. It says at that pillar, the depth is 0.6 meters. The river's not flowing fast. There's no strong current to be worried about. Would you cross the river or not? Hands up if you would cross the river. That's probably about 60% of you. Okay, brave people. A man standing by the river says he's lived there all his life, and he once took 3 measurements which showed depths of 0.2, 0.7, and 0.5 meters. Okay, would you still cross? Hands up if you'll cross the river. Okay, now we're down to about 50%. Some people are getting worried. An old hydrological survey once took 25 measurements and found a narrow, localized hole with a depth of 2.2 meters. The sort of thing you could sort of leap across. Would you still cross the river? We're down to about 20%. So let's say that's what the river actually looks like. That was your 0.5 meter measurement. There were your other 3 measurements. There's a whole blotch of measurements. There's that hole that wasn't even measured. And nobody told you about the crocodiles. So, this is your climate change dilemma. Will you cross the river? And how strong is the pressure for you to cross the river? Will you take the risk? What risk are you willing to take? There will always be unknowns. Okay? We cannot give you a singular future. The future is probabilistic. But we have to choose. And if we don't make the choice, not making a choice is making a choice. Whenever you choose something, you choose for something or against something. And when you don't make a choice, you let anything happen. So your decision will be based on how willing you are to take a risk. But your risk is a value-centered risk. It's what do you hold valuable? Do you hold the future of the world valuable? If that's one of your values, that should impact your risk. And of course, under climate change, the consequences are massive. So where do you get your information? I love this quote at the top there. The past or the future cannot affect us. But we can be affected by our conception of the future. How you think about the future is really, really important. And there's a host of information out there, a lot of it rubbish. So we have this confusing world where we fed information that we don't know how to trust, but we're affected by how we perceive the future. So who do you trust and why do you trust? Why are you even listening to me? Because I've got a title? You know, I could have bought my professorship. Who knows? You have to know me to be able to trust me. Okay, you need to build trust in your information source. So of course, more knowledge is less uncertainty. Now, knowledge means you understand something. Understanding requires information about something. Information is only relevant in a context. So, knowledge is information in context. So now we have a dual challenge. First, you have to understand your context. My context is I live in a suburb of Cape Town where I'm a small property and I have my social system around me, okay, in South Africa. A colleague of mine still living in New York has a very different context. The city of Lusaka, I've got people there that we've been working with in Lusaka recently. They have a very, very different context. So we need to get the information into the context. You have to have the context. You can't just have the information. Telling you global warming of 2 degrees is pretty much meaningless other than scaring you until you can translate that something into your context. And the uncertainty is if you have an inadequacy of information or an inadequacy of context. And unfortunately, the context is often forgotten. So when you're talking about climate change and Lusaka, you're talking about distance transfer of water, you're talking about the energy infrastructure, you're talking about residential boreholes depleting the groundwater, etc. When you're talking about New York, you're talking about the flooding of Manhattan. Okay. It's a different context altogether. When you're talking about Maputo, you're talking about tropical cyclones and flooding that comes down, comes down from Zimbabwe. So I want to take a slight diversion here now and talk to you about vision. What's your vision for the future? Because that will steer your choices. Now, vision is not what we see. Our eyes don't see. Our eyes take light, turn it into signals, and feed it to the brain. And in the darkness of your brain, you construct an image. Okay? Your brain is where you're seeing it. The eye is the filter to the light. Our brain takes what's been filtered in and interprets it, and usually throws away most of it because we can't handle all the information that's coming in. So our brain is the actual lens. So we need to think about what is the lens that we're looking at climate change through. Are you looking at climate change through protectionism, altruism, fear, greed? Because there's opportunities in climate change as well. What are the lenses that you're looking at climate change through? Now, I'm not going to presuppose what lens you're choosing, but I'd ask you to think for yourself, what is your lens? And I would say the most common lens, especially for a well-to-do family, is protectionism. How do I protect myself? But we live in a globally connected society, so we need to be careful. Because when a pretense becomes a pretext, through which we interpret the context, then we create an alternate reality. We create a reality that we want to see. Just look at Donald Trump. Creating alternative realities. Fake news. I don't like it. Because I don't like it, I won't believe it. This is incredible danger because we are all attracted by this. We may not do it to the same extent, but we all like to ignore what we don't want to face. But an alternate reality is not the reality we're going to confront. And so there's a huge danger in creating alternate realities. Oh, I'm okay because I've got a borehole. Well, you're not okay because you've got a borehole. Yes, you have better resilience, but you're not okay. Okay. So we fool ourselves. The mind is a great deceiver. And the challenge here is, can I break free of my constructed alternate reality? And I've wrestled with this for decades now, because I am preconditioned by growing up as I did in South Africa, growing up as a white in Cape Town. I had a privileged upbringing. I'm conditioned. You know, I want to protect myself. I want various things. And I have to break free of that because I see a global future that is disastrous if I don't break free of that alternate reality. So why are you here today? People without a vision drift aimlessly. I think everybody would agree with that. Vision without action, that's nothing more than a daydream. I think you'd agree with that. Action without vision is a nightmare, because just anything goes. So if we want to talk about vision for the future, we need to think about foresight, which is to look with the right lens at what's coming down the road. Insight, which is to understand what does that mean for my context. And oversight, to see my context in the bigger picture, that I'm in a connected world. It's about asking the right question. And a good test for a genuine question, I tell this to all my students, if you don't feel stupid when you ask the question, then you're not asking the right question. I have this lovely essay that I give them, I didn't write it, but this essay called about the value of feeling stupid. Because when you feel stupid, you are facing up to the unknown. If you don't feel stupid, you're basically you're masking yourself. You say, well, I already know what the answer is. I'm just asking a question to look good. And we all do that. We like to look good. So I'm encouraging you to feel stupid. Embrace the feeling of stupidity, because that's the only way you're actually going to change. Now, how do we change? Well, there are a number of studies that show society only changes when at least 30 or 40% of the society changes its behavior. Look at light bulbs. There's push-in light bulbs for ages, incandescent light bulbs, let's get rid of them, let's get rid of them. Nothing happened until we crossed a critical threshold of people actually changing the light bulbs. Because then you get a mass community sense of, oh yes, this is the way to go. So if we want to change society from the bottom up, remember I started off by saying we can't depend on the top down, because the top down is subject to lobbyists and vested interests. We have to also look at bottom up. We have to think about creating a community change. I'm looked at as a total nutcase in my community, because I have about 2 square meters of grass on my property. The rest is fruit trees, vegetable gardens, and so on. I have a pool, but it's an eco pool. There's no chemicals involved. It has a wetland. The wildlife in my garden is amazing. I have snakes. I have a cobra in my garden, in Claremont. We have frogs galore. We have chickens. We have bees. Okay. Now, I'm not saying this is the solution, but what I've done is I've created a little node of some resilience. We eat a lot of our own food, etc., etc. I drive a motorbike. We only have one car. And in the evenings, we walk around the neighborhood, my wife and I. I take the parrot on my hand. She picks up one of the chickens randomly, and we walk around the neighborhood with the chicken and the parrot. And when we meet people, we talk to them. Because when people see a parrot and a chicken, they really wonder what's going on here. But it's just a little bit of what I can do. Apart from my science work, and part of my international engagement work, I can talk to people. I can say, have you thought of this? I don't judge them. I don't say you should do this or you should do that. I say, have you thought of A, B, or C? Have you become aware, and can you become sensitized to it? So your values are your own. I don't judge your values. You have a worldview, whether you know it or not. One of the biggest challenges I give my honors students is they have to write an essay articulating their worldview. I've had some students refuse to hand it in because they feel it's too personal. I've had some students who've broken down in tears because they've suddenly realized the values they hold to. They'd never realized it before until they tried to articulate it. But your worldview will influence how you contribute to this problem. Your worldview will influence how you respond, how you manage the data and the information that's thrown at you from all these different sources, and how you communicate to others about it. I don't think we should all become raving nutters and walk around with chickens and parrots. But I do think we should all talk about this. Because it's only by talking that we will increase the awareness and get sensitized. Then secondly, values are also personal, but are also acquired. And we need to think about what we hold on as values. Are they valid values? Or should they be values that we question? So I challenge you, how well do you know your own values? If I put you on the spot here and said, tell me your value system, could you actually tell me right now? It's a hard challenge. And what do you do if you meet somebody who has different values? Do you say they're wrong or you're right? Obviously you believe you're right, or you wouldn't hold them. So by implication, you think they're wrong. But what if they're right and you're wrong? Again, it's a self-questioning, a self-examination in order to respond to this global challenge. So climate change is around reducing and managing risks. We are not going to avoid climate change. We are on target for a 3-degree world. I see very little chance that we're going to avoid that. So how do you match this to context? So we did a project in the last 4 years where we dealt with 9 African cities, dealing with the city governance structures to say, let's help you deal with climate change. Let's help you put on the right lens to look at the data information in a way that fits your context. And you just take Lusaka, for example. So there's a map of Lusaka. So that's a city urban planner's view of Lusaka. This is the climate modeler's view of Lusaka. It's a little spot in the middle of Africa there. And this is the street person's view of Lusaka. We can barely see the street light. I mean the traffic light. Different context. Each person is embedded in a different context. They have to relate have to translate the information into their context. And our challenge in this project was to say, how do I translate this into this or into this? And it's a huge problem. But we have to deal with that translation of information into context. So the top tension we have in the world at the moment is your context carries different values. If you're a Republican from the US, or if and you're looking at libertarian type ideas, free market economy, or if you're China and you have 30-year policies because you're a dictatorial society and you can do 30-year policies, or if you're in the Maldives or somewhere and your island's going to be swamped in the future, you have different contexts with different values. And the globe needs to come together to try and wrestle with this. And to do that, it's a people problem. It's a societal problem. So decisions are based on knowledge. How am I doing for time, Frank? Am I running out? Okay, right. I'll try and go a little bit quicker on this. Knowledge is information in context. Well, let me give you a brief story about a project that we did in Maputo. We ran a workshop. We were looking at climate change and malaria, and we were talking about how do you manage malaria, and we said if we give the city extra budget, how would you allocate that extra budget on managing malaria? There are two approaches to managing malaria. The one is prevention, the other is treatment. Okay? Those are the two ways you do it. So we brought in the communities, the bureaucrats and the clinic workers in the field. And we said, come together, let's say hypothetical, we give you more budget, what will you do with climate change? The health field workers based all their decisions on how many lives I can save. They were all saying prevention, 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 prevention. If I can save a life, that's the best way to spend the money. Regardless of the fact that if I give them a bed net and it's too hot, so they don't sleep under the bed net, or they use the bed net for a fishing net, which happens. Regardless of those issues, they say if I can save a life, that's the best thing to do with the money. The resource manager said, no, cost-benefit basis. It's more cost-beneficial to do treatment. Let them get malaria, and we'll treat them in the clinics. Fundamental, same society, same culture, fundamental different viewpoints. And they ignore things like that. If a person gets malaria, it's probably recurrent over multiple years, and malaria probably hits in the harvest season anyway. So it takes the labor force out the fields and all sorts of consequences. But there are these sort of narrow views on what it means. And neither community really got to grips with how the other saw it. It's hard to stand in somebody else's shoes and see the world as they see it. So what questions to ask? Loads of questions. But you can ask, what is my vulnerability in an interconnected world? How do I build resilience for myself and my family? Do I have a responsibility to do something and I'm avoiding that responsibility? Am I able to construct a risk management solution for my context? These are not easy questions to answer.
Let's face it,
Okay, so I'm going to show you a little video we made. It's 1.5 minutes. We made it for trying to get people to think about how to handle uncertainty for climate change. It's not exactly climate change, but this is something that we did under the role of climate change. So,
let's face it, we all live with uncertainty, but act anyway. Has my alarm clock lost time while I slept? Will the kids be ready? Will the car start? Will the traffic flow? Should I take an umbrella, gumboots, or a raincoat? Just getting the kids to school on time has many uncertainties. To wait for certainty would mean we would never get out the door. Uncertainty doesn't stop us from planning. It inspires us to do so. Alternative routes, lift clubs, alternative outfits. It's about having options. We know some things about tomorrow, such as the sun will rise. But how cloudy will it be? Likewise, we're making the world warmer. But how will that change our local weather? Some places will get wetter, some drier, some more extreme. This affects food production, water supplies, natural disasters, economies, and more. We already know enough to inform our responses. Science gives us some clear messages of what the changes will include. But where, when, and by how much these changes will occur is not entirely clear. The challenge is to ask, what do we know well enough to help manage our risk? And because my risk is your risk too, what can we tell each other to achieve the best outcome?
Okay, I'll stop it there. So that was an attempt to try and get a message through to a society that is not well aware of climate change. This was done with our city partners that we're looking at in that project I mentioned. So I'm going to end on that. I hope I've prompted you to think, if nothing else. I hope I've not been too judgmental. I hope I've raised your element of I'm worried. And I hope it leads to you talking to other people about this and trying to raise a community sense of how do we respond, where do we go from here. Thank you. Okay.
If you have questions for Bruce,
You do the lights, I don't know. Yeah, okay, well, I don't know how to do this. Okay, there are two at the back there. Take left or right first.
I think you've convinced us that the immediate climate change is any evidence that there's a bigger cycle that what goes will change back to order in some future. And one thing I'm thinking of perhaps that change with magnetic fields in the Earth, how that might influence other than magnetic.
Right. So the question, if you didn't hear it, is are there natural cycles and how they're impacting it, and things like the changing polar field, which is reducing at the moment, the magnetic field, sorry. Yes, there are natural cycles. Clear natural cycles, we know them, we identify them. Some of them we can explain, not all of them we can explain. But the natural cycles that are going on at the moment, for example, the Milankovitch cycle, for example, the trend in solar output, are all leading to a cooler world, and yet we're getting hotter. So we should actually be hotter than we are at the moment. Those natural cycles are actually helping us at this point. But of course, those natural cycles are very long-term cycles, and we don't live on those timescales. We are warming the world faster than, as best we can tell, has ever been warmed in geological history. So yes, they're there, but they're not part of the problem. What the polar magnetic field collapse do, if that does collapse, there are various stories about how that will impact climate. It's not exactly clear how it will impact climate, but it will have an impact of some form, yes. Sorry. Yeah.
Yes, you mentioned 3 degrees as being likely, and recognizing my question is probably quite value laden. I'm just interested in your perspectives on climate engineering and its potential efficacy.
Yeah, so geoengineering is where we basically engineer the world by putting sulfates in the stratosphere, or we fertilize the oceans with iron particles, or do something like that. An example of accidental geoengineering is the deforestation that's going on. We are geoengineering the world because we changed the reflectivity of the land surface by that. But there's a lot pushed now about we are only going to manage future climate change by severe geoengineering of some sort of magnitude like that. Bill Gates is a big supporter, for example. He wants to put particles into the stratosphere to reflect sunlight. They will work theoretically. They are very costly. And the problem comes back to a value question. Because when you're geoengineering in one locality, you change the climate in another locality. And sometimes the change will be unpredictable. So I'll not be surprised if we see some geoengineering. I have little hope that geoengineering is going to be our solution. It's just too fraught with ancillary dangers, collateral damage. If you, for example, we had this problem with cloud seeding in the 60s and 70s. If you cloud seed over here, you get the rain out the cloud over there, well, you've taken the water away from somebody else over there. So there are these ethical equity issues. And I don't yet see how we're going to get over that. But geoengineering is going to be on the table for a while yet.
Also,
Yeah.
some of what we mentioned was
Yeah, so I think we're going to see more and more of that. GM crops, tailored for different climates. We can do that to a degree. There are a lot of ancillary dangers with it. The one is heading for monocultures, which are particularly vulnerable. But the other is, who controls the seed? And if you think about the control of a geoengineered seed and the activities of companies like Monsanto in developing nations, you're talking about a real heavy power relationship that is open to abuse and greed for profit. So yes, we are already doing that. We are we are engineering species differences, not species, sorry. What's the word I'm looking for? Crop alternatives, yeah. And again, it'll be part of the mix. I mean, the solution to climate change is not going to be a single golden bullet. It's going to be a mix of things. But all of them come with dangers, which are value dangers, which we have to think about. How are we going to manage the value danger? And is a government strong enough to actually legislate how a geoengineered seed is going to be used? And I'm not convinced. Yeah.
How did climate change become such a political football?
Yeah, I'll repeat it, yeah, I'm sure. How did climate change become such a political football? Because it's a basic scientific fact. Okay. It becomes a political football because to respond to climate change means changing economic practices. And money is the underlier. So it started off with the fossil fuel industries, adopting the tobacco industry strategies. That's a direct playbook transferable. Because they're trying to protect their industry. They're trying to protect the bottom line. So it becomes political because nations are saying, well, why should I take the first hit when somebody else benefits? So we have this big tension between China and the US. You're saying we're not going to change because we want our economy strong, we want our economy to grow, etc., etc. And why should we change and take a hit while China still develops their fossil fuel-based industry? Which is a legitimate argument, but if everybody says that, who starts? And the only country really starting is Europe. So, for example, the UK has legislated carbon neutrality by 2050. That's a bold step. Other countries in Europe are doing that now. Germany particularly is leading the way. The European Union is the leader in the world in terms of saying we will take the initial penalty in order to move towards a more climate-friendly basis. But of course, they're just one community. I think in the long term, they're wise because they have now the head start on all the technological developments that are needed for that. I think it's short-term blindness to not respond. But yeah, so it's political. Everybody's looking after their vested interest. And couple that with the growth of nationalism around the world, the minute you're under threat, what do? You pull in the borders. You ring yourself. The world is under threat at the moment in many frontiers, not just climate. And so we have this massive growth in nationalism, and that just feeds this idea, well, why should I be the first one to start? And so it becomes political. So.
What do you think of the theory that global warming will eventually lead to an ice age because it slows down the warm currents of the world?
So the question is the theory that global warming will lead to an ice age. Well, it depends what you mean by an ice age, regional or global. Okay, so global warming at the moment, there's no indication this is going to trigger us into something that has a negative feedback that pushes us into a global ice age. However, there's this thing called the thermohaline circulation. It's a global circulation system. Gulf Stream is part of it. Western Europe, UK is warmer than it would be because of the Gulf Stream pushing up through the North Atlantic, across the North Atlantic. As you melt Greenland, you create a pool of fresh water. That pool of fresh water sits there as a buffer to the Gulf Stream current coming across the North Atlantic. It pushes that warm current further south. And so it is conceivable that if the thermohaline circulation shuts down to that degree, Western Europe could go into a mini ice age. You could go back to skating on the canals in Holland, possibly. Possibly. I don't think it's going to happen because I think the warming is too strong. But we have no clear answer on that. But it is a possibility. But it won't be global, no. Yep.